Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and let's make this thing weird by leading with the following incredibly loaded question. Hey, what do you think about taxes? Are you a pretty big fan? Like, you think that's a good idea? It'd be good if we did a lot more. Do you generally tend to think that's a pretty bad idea? It's an interesting question. It really is, because taxes at their core aren't optional, as we discussed yesterday. You have to do that, and there's a big or else at the end of every tax law. I mean, if you don't pay your taxes and you refuse to go along with whatever fine or punishment goes with it, it's going to escalate pretty dang high. Taxes have teeth to them. But I know there's some people who look at the world and they're like, I have tremendous optimism in the capacity of the central planners to take wealth, redistribute it, and pursue good and noble ends that will make society better. Cool. Some people really read it that way. Other people look at it and they're like, no, I believe more in the individual and not in central planning. And I don't think those redistributive ends have been as successful as some people might like to imagine. And probably a whole bunch of people from all over that spectrum are sitting here in the conversation. But regardless of what you think big picture about taxation as a moral proposition, as a historical reality, as a reality of life that has become inescapable. It's always been inescapable. Regardless of what you think about all that stuff, I think we all have to admit that at some point in our lives, we have seen taxation that we thought was too dang much. I mean, 100% taxation is too dang much. And I think everybody would morally agree that slavery, whether imposed by the state or held up by the state, is just that's too much. You can't tax people at 100% of all of their labor and earning. But historically, a ton of people have done that. So I think we'd all agree, that's immoral. And probably most of us would say 99%, that would still be immoral. Like if you let somebody keep just a tiny little pittance, that would still be wrong. So all of us can imagine a version of taxation that we think is morally wrong. But I think all of us can also, no matter how much maybe you don't like taxation as a general principle, I think also all of us can probably look at it and be like, okay, maybe there it makes sense. We got this parking situation here in downtown Rapid City, which is a beautiful downtown. It's a really neat old West town, downtown, brick buildings, tons of cool shops. This is a great place to hang out, to get food, whatever. And there isn't a ton of parking. And just in terms of the ebb and flow and rhythms of our community, all the parking spaces downtown would always be full if there wasn't some kind of plan there. And so I think probably the private sector could solve the problem. In this case, the city council tried to address the problem by simply putting in parking meters, and then you pay like $1 to park for an hour or two. It's really no big deal. It's not a ton of money at all. And it keeps everybody moving. It keeps cars moving in and out. Cars don't set up shop downtown. And as a result, all the businesses work and everybody has the opportunity to enjoy downtown. Maybe that's the kind of tax that you could look at and be like, oh, that's okay. But the point is this: it doesn't work to just ask somebody, what do you make of taxes? How do you feel about taxes? Because taxes mean a lot of different things, and there are a lot of different kinds of taxes. And I suppose everybody might have different thoughts on different types of levies or taxes, depending on the moral quality of the proposition. Likewise, when we have the word tax come up in the Bible, in this case in Matthew chapter 17, if we immediately allow our brains to jump to whatever tax, whether it's one you love or one you detest, that immediately springs to mind in a modern context, I promise you, we're going to be picturing something different than what would have sprung to mind for the original audience here. In the original audience in the first century AD, they had a ton of different taxes that floated around. And I'm sure that everybody Matthew was writing to had some tax that was charged to them over the course of their lives that they thought was odious and completely inappropriate. But I'm also guessing that pretty much everybody in Matthew's audience was able to look at some of these things and be like, that one makes sense. We probably all need to kick in, or that thing that we really want to happen isn't going to happen. I suspect that the tax we are talking about in Matthew chapter 17 is one that for the original audience would not have conjured the notion of a horrible, odious burden inflicted upon them. I suspect that this might have been a tax that people viewed as a noble, patriotic duty and privilege to get to pay, because it wasn't a governmental tax. It was a religious tax, which in and of itself makes it something of an odd word. And apparently there was some ambiguity as to whether this temple tax was actually mandatory or not. It's not clear to me what kind of punishment during the Roman occupation could actually have been leveled against somebody who didn't pay it, but it was there and it was clearly a cultural expectation and it went way, way back in time. So, what I want to try to figure out today is what is this temple tax thing exactly that we're hearing about in Matthew 17, as Matthew writes about this thing as though everybody in the original audience would know what he's talking about, and how would the original audience have felt about it? Where would their sympathies have immediately rested upon hearing this question of whether or not Jesus paid this tax? Here's the passage once again, Matthew 17, starting in verse 24. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" Yes, he does, he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "And then the sons are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But, so that we may not offend them, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you'll find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." It looks like the tax in question was so well known by everybody that Matthew, who was something of a tax expert, didn't even bother to lead with the temple tax in relaying the account. He just said the 2 drachma tax, as though everybody would know exactly what that meant. And then it isn't until we get into the direct quote from the tax collectors, who are not followers of Jesus, that we actually hear that we're talking about the temple tax. So we got a little linguistic hint here that Matthew assumes everybody knows what he's talking about. This thing originates in Exodus chapter 30. And this is in the middle of a whole bunch of details about what life is going to look like now that we have exodized. And one of these details has the Lord saying to Moses, Exodus 30, verse 12, "When you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come upon them when you number them. Each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give a half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs." I think I'm saying that right. The half shekel is an offering to the Lord. All who cross over, those 20 years old or more, are to give an offering to the Lord. The rich are not to give more than a half shekel, and the poor not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives. Receive the atonement money from the Israelites and use it for the service of the tent of meeting. That's an interesting passage in light of Matthew chapter 17 and what we're looking at today, because it doesn't look like there's anything there that says, and you're supposed to do this forever. It looks like a one-off event, and it looks like you're supposed to take this amount that was very specified in terms of weight based on some temple official units of weights and measurement. You're supposed to give this much if you're 20 years or older, and the rationale behind it. Did you catch that? It's to acknowledge that you were ransomed by God. You were bought back out of slavery. So in a way, they're kicking in on that ransom a little bit. I don't know. It's theologically really interesting what's going on there. It never comes up again, maybe in Nehemiah. But it's a fascinating passage. It really is an interesting little Old Testament aside. But apparently that got some legs. It caught on and it stuck around. And it wasn't a one-time thing that people looked back on and were like, remember that time when we got the money and we set up the tabernacle? Not even the temple at that point, the tabernacle, and we covered our costs with it. I guess I can see that from two perspectives. The first perspective is, well, it was a one-time deal to make a one-time theological point, and that's what the text says. And I guess we're done here. But then from the other perspective, it's not like that would have paid the bills forever. It's not exactly fluid money. Once you collect that money one time and convert it into ornamentation for what happens and sacrificial furniture and stuff, you can't just turn that into cash again the next time you need to buy some livestock or new outfits for the priests. I suppose it's the kind of thing that would be very easy to look back on and say, nah, that is precedent setting. Even though it isn't explicitly laid out as something we're going to do forever. Come on, how are we supposed to keep this thing afloat if there isn't some official means by which it all gets paid for? Our religion is national. God is our king. Therefore, it would make sense for this to be a tax. And during the age of the theocracy in the distant Old Testament, it becomes a tax because God is king and he wanted the tax, they say, and then it sticks after the theocracy is long gone and now you're into a traditional monarchy or even an occupation situation like happened so much in the several hundred years leading up to the time of Jesus. Whatever the case, it trickles down through history, and this tax thing is still in place, and it's something that was highly expected. It apparently helped to defray the costs incurred by running the temple, which was a lot pricier than I think you would figure at first glance. You got all those sacrifices. Animals are expensive, and you got to keep them around. You got to keep them alive. You got to feed them. You have a whole bunch of people who work there. How are they supposed to pay their bills? I assume they got paid by this temple tax. And these are the most competent, well-educated people in society at the time, or at least that's how people behaved, is with that assumption. Their degrees had social currency. Their titles and outfits had social currency. So they're probably getting paid really well also. So this tax, I'm sure, was very important for propping things up. But can you really call it a tax if it's optional? If there's no government teeth behind it? The drachma is the nickname for the tax, or the 2 drachma tax. This is a reference to a Greek coin. The coin apparently that was most commonly used at this point, and we'll break this down a little bit more later on too, was a Tyrian shekel. And there's a whole story with that. And yeah, I'm going to wait to tell you more about the Tyrian shekel because it's pretty funny the way this all worked out and how those shekels were minted and what the history of that coin actually is. But the quick preview version here is that intentional governmental decisions were made to continue to mint a certain coin that made it easy to pay this tax, which I believe was paid in the spring of every year. Tax collectors went and set up a booth representative of the temple, and everybody in a town had to roll by and pay it. And if you didn't, and it got toward the end of the month where you were supposed to pay it, they would go around door to door and be like, hey, were you going to pay the tax or were you not? And again, I don't know how much teeth that actually had. And so that's probably what we're getting to here. Jesus and Peter have been out on the road. They just got back to Capernaum. It's temple tax month, and the temple tax month was probably winding down, and it hasn't been paid yet. So Peter and Jesus and the crew roll back in, and pretty quickly the temple tax guys, probably imagining they're doing a kind service to Peter and to Jesus, come on over. I don't see this as an attack. Like, oh, it's a courtesy call. Please pay the thing, and then you pay the thing, and it's all squared up. Thank you, as always. I don't know why I always feel the impulse to say thank you when we have a deep dive history episode, because it seems like you all enjoy them. But thank you, as always, for enduring, digging into the cultural background here, and giving me permission to tear into that, because I find it really fascinating and fun. And I think it makes the text make way more sense, and we will try to get into the payoff for the work we have put in on this over the next couple of days. Finally, as always, thank you a ton to all of the people who make this program happen by supporting it at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. I think you are neat. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.